fields of books in mathematics, including 2 books which have appeared in English. That part of his identity we already dealt with on Monday when he gave a wonderful talk on mathematics. This evening we're going to be talking about history and the relationship between history and science. Giorgio is a rather remarkable intellectual. Many of us specialize in only one thing. Giorgio, aside from his mathematical inclinations, has a blog on the internet where he comments on world events. He's frequently on Italian television as well. He also is the co-author of a very important monograph, basically on the topic on which he'll be speaking tonight, on race and science and the expulsion of Jewish scientists from Italian universities in 1938. This is, I can mention to you as an Italian specialist myself, an incredible monograph. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar study for the humanities. We only have one for the sciences. Hopefully in the future, one of Giorgio's younger colleagues, I understand, is already collecting documents, but hasn't turned the corner yet from collecting documents to sitting down and write. Let me briefly try to contextualize the problem that Giorgio will be addressing. After World War II, there was the myth of the good Italian, or as one says in Italy, Italiani bravi gente. And in the literature on the Holocaust, the good Italian was contrasted with the bad German. And indeed, there was some reason to support this myth. Italians saved Jews in tremendous proportion. It's said that only 15% of the Italian Jewish community perished, although that figure has been challenged in recent years. Nevertheless, it's true that many Italians of all walks of life, including Italian fascists, saved Jews when the German army began its occupation of northern Italy in the fall of 1943. However, this is the problem. When the war was over and normal life began, what had happened to the Jews was largely forgotten. It was a source of embarrassment for many Italians, including many fascists. One could argue it was the greatest stain on fascism. And then again, perhaps Giorgio will go into this. I know we collaborated on the role of Italian intellectuals, is that many Italian intellectuals, when the racial legislation went into effect, expressed very little solidarity with their Jewish friends and colleagues, and indeed many of them collaborated even more intimately with the regime than they did before. So the problem was, if you opened up what had happened to the Jews, you would open up this period in which their pasts were compromised. So what was done is to treat Jews as victims of fascism, a much larger category, much less problematic. Of course, that wasn't completely accurate, since Jews weren't targeted for discrimination because they were anti-fascists. They were targeted for discrimination because they were Jews. To this day, there's controversy, and this is what my scholarship is engaged in, is what caused the regime to turn to racism in 1938? Because racism wasn't part of the formative principles of fascism. They were Italian Jews who were fascists, they were Italian Jews who were anti-fascist. Really, this had nothing to do with it, really until the middle of the 1930s. So the question then, what precipitated this change? And there's controversy over that. There's less controversy now regarding what happened. What were the consequences of these laws? Part of the myth of the good Italian was, well, you know, these laws weren't taken seriously. They were largely symbolic. They were put in place to satisfy Hitler, but they weren't rigorously enforced. Well, I can assure you that in my study of Italy, it would be hard to find any other legislation which was as thoroughly and relentlessly enforced as the racial legislation. We have to begin this story in the summer of 1938, when there was a racial manifesto issued allegedly by Italian scientists. I'm sure Giorgio will say something about the racial manifesto. In May, Hitler visited Italy for the first time. And this wasn't just a normal visit. If one would go back, as I did, looking at the newspapers of the period, for some reason every newspaper, the front page was divided in half. Half was in Italian, covering this event, and half was in German. Not that many people in Italy who read German, but this symbolism was extremely important. The racial laws went into effect later, in the fall of 1938. Now, I can't describe in detail all the ramifications of the racial legislation, except to note that they had reduced Jews to the status of second-class citizens. Jews who were well integrated in Italian society were now isolated. Jews who worked in any form of government service were expelled. In terms of schools, Jewish children were thrown out of schools. So were their teachers, so were college professors. And indeed, this is what Giorgio will be talking about in terms of the Science Faculty. This was not insignificant, because Jews were well represented in leadership positions in government, in academia, in business. Jews were 0.1% of the population, but they were 7% of the professoriate. So we can see that though this was a small population, it was a population of significance. Now, there weren't pogroms. Nothing like that. As a matter of fact, the government never really tried to mobilize the masses against the Jews. The motto was discrimination, not persecution. Discrimination, not persecution. However, when the Germans occupied northern Italy, they made great use of the lists, the inventory of properties that had been accumulated by the government. And this made it much easier for the Germans to round up Jews during the occupation. You might ask, well, this is interesting, but why is it terribly important what had happened to Italy, especially in relation to Germany? Well, let me begin to sketch out a little something to say on that. When we think of the anti-Semitism in Europe of the 1930s, what usually was the case was that the anti-Semitism which manifested itself in Europe in the third quarter of the 19th century, when there was significant anti-Semitism, was simply recycled. These were well-known themes. But in Italy, there wasn't this history of anti-Semitism, certainly in the post-unification period. As I said, Jews were well integrated into Italian society. They were never isolated. They were never looked at as a different community, the way, for example, Polish Jews were. They didn't speak Yiddish, they didn't speak Hebrew, they didn't speak Ladino. They spoke Italian like everybody else. To show you how well integrated they were, the intermarriage rate among the Italian Jewish community was the highest of all the Jewish communities in Europe. So obviously, If there were a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, you wouldn't have this intermarriage rate. Furthermore, in Italy, before World War I, there were 3 prime ministers of Jewish origin. You won't find this in any other country. In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is this isn't the predictable case. If I were talking about France or Germany or Austria or Poland, I would say it's no surprise that in the 1930s they'd be anti-Semitic. But here you have a case in which it wasn't deeply rooted in the history, it wasn't deeply rooted in society, and nevertheless there was this racial legislation, which I think is rather frightening because it suggests that in modern society, in modern societies, it's possible to have racism without deep historical roots. This can be manufactured from the top down. So that's why I think the Italian case is particularly significant. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the German case and what happened to German scientists. There were so many German Jewish scientists as well, many of whom came to the United States, where they assumed prominence in all fields: science, history, philosophy, sociology. There was an incredible case in which German professors went to Turkey at the very time that Ataturk wanted to create universities in Turkey. He brought these Jewish professors there. Well, something of the same sort happened with many Italian intellectuals, not just scientists. Arnaldo Mogliano was a great classicist. He left. He actually finished in Chicago. But among this group of scientists, the generation that left, among the generation that left, and came to the United States, there were 4 Nobel Prize winners. Now, when you consider that Italy from the very beginning has 12 Nobel Prizes in the sciences, and here you have 4 from one generation, you can appreciate the consequences not only on the Jews who were forced out, the consequences on Italy, on Italian science. So, before I step any further on Giorgio's toes, let me ask you to give him a warm welcome to Macalester.
The literature on the racial policies promoted by the Nazi regime is very extensive and deals with both its theoretical and its sociological aspects. The first aspects are related to the contribution that various scientific disciplines such as anthropology, biology, eugenics, and demography made to the foundation of its racial policies. The latter aspects cover the role that the German scientific community played in the realization of that policy and the consequences to the scientific community itself, mostly due to the immigration of Jewish or anti-Nazi scientists, which impoverished German science to the point of causing it to lose its leading position vis-à-vis the United States. This particular line of research was not following to the same extent in the case of Italy. The reason for this relative lack of attention can be traced to the fact that the German case is so significant and produced such dramatic effects that it relegated the Italian case to the background. Moreover, the anti-Semitic racial policy had a central constitutive role in Nazi racism. That it served as a basic function in Hitler's political view. The same certainly cannot be said in the case of Italy. The Mussolini regime only adopted a racist legislation in 1938, and in the preceding years it repeatedly distanced itself from the measures and racial policies of its German ally. This difference led some historians to consider that fascism, anti-Semitic racial policy, was marginal reducing it to an act of deference toward its German ally, a concession toward the request received from Hitler. But a more accurate and historical analysis shows that this was not the case. Italian fascism elaborated its own racial policy with its own autonomous and original characteristics, which were reflected in the legal measures adopted in 1938. The divergence from Nazism as regards the racial policies the latter had adopted starting 1934 did not diminish but rather increased in the period between 1938 and 1943. This element of divergence could be captured in the phrase quoted by my friend, in the phrase discriminate, not persecute. The fascists did not propose exterminating Jews, but rather eliminating them from national life. This was clearly a hypocritical formula because the cruel, pedantic, and methodically applied measures that they implemented were in fact persecutory. But in my opinion, both simple interpretation of fascist racism are wrong. The one claiming it was marginal and the result of a contingent political choice, and the one stating that the anti-Semitic racial policy had a constitutive role in the fascist ideology. In Italy, side by side with what is traditionally considered the determining factor, that is choice dictated by foreign policy, all the factors without exception that contributed to determining the choice of developing a racial policy should also be considered. Fascist racial policy can be understood only at the point of convergence of a number of paths that were followed, which, although distinct and independent, ultimately produce an explosive cumulative effect. Now I will describe briefly these various factors. It is usually agreed that Italy is a European country where anti-Semitism was never particularly virulent. And this is true, but some clarification is necessary. Anti-Semitism in Italy was largely connected to religion, and in fact was nothing more than Catholic traditional anti-Semitism. This accounts for one of the peculiar characteristics of anti-Semitism in Italy. Catholic anti-Semitism did not aim at persecuting the Jews on the basis of race, nor did it seek their physical elimination, but rather its goal was to dissolve their religious identity. The main objective was therefore the conversion of each and every Jew, the dissolving of all Israel into the new Catholic Israel. Conversion will redeem every Jew from any sin and integrate him or her fully into the Christian faith. Catholic anti-Semitism, apart from some notable exception originating in Jesuit circles, was not the same as the biologically based German racism, which by claiming that races were inevitably different, offered no other alternative but the pure and simple destruction of the Jewish race. Hence, Italian racism, under the influence of the Catholic Church, could only emerge through a definition of race not in the biological sense, but as a cultural and spiritual identity. Therefore, in Italy, the idea of biological racism was viewed with considerable suspicion, and the rather ambiguous notion of race was preferred. The most popular term was in Italian stirpe. We could translate descent. When compared with Italic descent, Jewish descent was characterized not so much by its biological diversity, as by a set of spiritual, cultural, and religious elements, as well as of customs that were considered as totally different from those dominant in the country. A perfect rendition of this idea can be found in 1939 news report by the Fascist University Group in Catanzaro. Racism is not only a biological problem, but also and mainly an ethical problem touching the conscience of all of us and sharpening the sense of nation, the sense of this human community united by a common language, religion and history, but which has its main element of cohesion in that identity of thought and action which are independent of the psychological conformation of a unitary race. According to the pathologist Nicola Pende, one of the main theoreticians of Italian racism, the concept of race must be dynamic, synthetic, evolutional, and this concept, when applied to the case of Italy, provides us with a notion of Roman-Italic unity. The latter was the result of the merging of Aryan Italic peoples into a superior unity that was different from other European Aryans, with its own anthropological and psychological characteristics. Of course, this unity ended up determining also its unitary and distinct physical and biological characteristics. The Jews were alienated from this unity and therefore breeding the superior biological state of the Italian nation implied a strong prohibition against marrying Italians with people who, like the Jews, Ethiopians and Arabs, are so far from people of Roman Italic descent. In this theoretical vision that provided the grounds for exclusion and discrimination measures rather than measures aiming at physical elimination, fascist racial legislation clearly reflected this formulation, and in this sense it differentiated itself from the German one. In order to understand why those policies and measures were accepted, particularly among intellectuals, several factors should be taken into account. One of these factors was the peculiarity of Italian nationalism, which may be traced back to the myth of Rome, the mother of peoples, capable of unifying different peoples in a common ethical and spiritual vision, and not the myth of blood and race, which was the main myth used by German nationalism. But one of the most interesting aspects is the role of the policy of population, demographic, eugenics, and autogenetics in the diffusion of a racial view which, although within the spiritualistic characteristic mentioned above, ended up sinking its root deeper and deeper and polluting minds. Let us say something about how population issues were perceived in Western countries in the first few decades of the 20th century. One of the most worrying problems was the general demographic decline in European countries. On top of this quantitative problem, there was a qualitative problem, the assumed decline in the anthropological quality of Europeans with respect to other peoples. Some thought its causes were a sort of biological degeneration, a decreasing reproductive power, an inevitable genetic decadence due to the inexorable scientific laws governing the ascent and decline of peoples. The problem of the handicapped peoples, of the flawed and degenerate elements, and of the negative influence they could have leading to the decline of a population became an obsessive theme in all European societies and also in the United States, involving also the scientific world. In this period, eugenics came into the limelight. Scientists were divided between supporters of the so-called positive eugenics, which aimed at identifying the health and hygiene practices capable of improving the general state of the population, and the so-called negative eugenics, which aimed at obtaining the same result through coercive and violent practices, from the prohibition of marriage between the so-called flawed subject to the sterilization of the subjects. Even in democratic countries such as the Scandinavian countries, negative eugenics was used to justify violent practices such as the forced sterilization of psychologically disturbed women or the forced removal of their children. The population problem was therefore considered as an essentially physical and biological problem, and the population as a material that could be handled with unscrupulous techniques justified in terms of a superior and national ethics. However, negative eugenics was less successful in Italy, partly due to the reason which I explained, to the opposition of the Catholic Church, and also due to the general more spiritualistic stance of Italic racism. In the first few decades of the 20th century, anthropology coincided with physical anthropology, that is, the study of the physical structure of individuals in order to draw conclusions as to their social and psychological behavior. Physical anthropology contained a dangerous racial inclination. The study of physical characteristics almost ended up aiming at the identification of racial diversities and therefore of superiority and inferiority characteristics. The unanimous adherence of anthropologists to such an approach illustrates the gloomy and unwholesome climate in which this kind of scientific research took place. It is also distressing to observe that prominent scientists such as Corrado Gini, former president of the Central Institute of Statistics, a distinguished Italian statistical demographic scientist, participated in ventures such as the 1935 mission involving the indigenous Dawada population of the Libyan lakes of Fezzan. Plaster molds were taken of the native spaces and their basal metabolism was measured for the declared purpose of not only, I quote, discovering the laws which regulate human psychological phenomena, but also basing on them measures of contingent and practical order. All this was done for the apparent and declared the purpose of identifying the biopsychological diversities of the indigenous population and proposing measures to adopt for the best management of this human material of which the fascist empire came into possession. Just as significant is the perseverance with which an impressive number of scientists, from Nicola Pende to Sabato Visco to Corrado Gini, under the auspices of the President of the National Research Council, Guglielmo Marconi, embraced the human breeding ground, this was the unfortunate phrase used at the time, represented by the famine population originating from the northeast of Italy, who has colonized the reclaimed Pontine marshes. They seem to believe that this human breeding ground, or laboratory of human biology, another common phrase at the time, was the ideal context in which to apply a form of rational eugenics and implement those improvements that applied on a large scale would enable the weaving of physical, moral, and intellectual habits for the great new homeland, that is the creation of a new superior biological state of the nation in Pende's words. This climate of fanaticism, the favor received by these views, their wide circulation starting from the mid-20s, made a strong contribution to the formation of a racist mindset that manifested itself through political and legislative measures in the 1930s. The first occasion was the transformation of the Kingdom of Italy into a colonial empire. The occupation of vast African lands, their colonization through a massive migratory movement of Italian colonizers, established a direct contact with other races. The need to avoid promiscuity that might diminish the image of Italians as masters and dominators induced the regime to introduce racial legislative measures. These were the first Italian racial laws, justified by the theory that most of the scientific world had labored to set up and that were now being used directly as theoretical support. The second racial laws were those targeting the other race Italians were in contact with and from which they had to distinguish themselves to avoid any risk of dangerous and debilitating contamination, the Jews. In this crucial transition from theory to practice, and ultimately to the serious and dramatic concrete consequences, one decisive factor was at play: the colonial and imperial aims of Mussolini's regime. Between 1935 and 1938, Fascism Mussolini decided to steer towards a policy which, in a sense, brought it back to its originally revolutionary inspiration. The polemic against the decadent bourgeoisie and the goal of making a definitive break with any form of compromise with liberal and democratic behavior was the main aim. In 1937, Mussolini was exasperated by the difficulties encountered in instilling in the Italian people a national conscience and the sentiment of being a strong, dominant, and, if necessary, cruel people. He therefore decided to deliver 3 heavy body blows, in these terms, to the stomach of the bourgeoisie. These 3 heavy body blows were the abolition of the servile lay, there is no translation in English of lay, but is a very formal form, and in the favor of the more virile form, voi, the introduction of the Roman goose step in military parades, and finally racism and the anti-Jewish racist legislation. That Mussolini was obsessed in those years by the question of the decadence of Western civilization is shown by his intention to write a book manifesto setting out the characteristic of a new civilization that would inject a new life in the West. The title of the book was to be Europe 2000, and its central theme demographic and racial in nature. Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister Galeazzo Ciano made it decentering in his theory. The Duce has lashed out against America, a country of Negroes and Jews, an element leading to the breakdown of civilization. He wants to write a book, Europe in the year 2000. The races that will play an important role will be the Italians, the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese. The other people will have been destroyed by the acid of Jewish corruption. They even refuse to have children because of the pain they cause. They do not realize that pain is the only creative element in the life of a people and also in that of individuals. The racism of Italian fascism was therefore an autonomous movement endowed with peculiar characteristics and not a simple copy of foreign trends. It was an extreme expression of fascist nationalism. Reliable evidence of this was provided by the redactor-in-chief of the most important journal of racism in Italy, La Difesa della Razza, Giorgio Almirante, which in 1938 wrote, "Racism is the most far-reaching and courageous recognition of itself that Italy had ever attempted. those who fear even today that it is a foreign imitation, Germany obviously, do not realize that they are thinking irrationally. It is really absurd to suspect that the movement meant to give Italian a race conscience, that is something like a nationalism multiplied fivefold, can possibly lead to enslavement to foreign ideologies. Starting from the end of the 20s, Mussolini had considered the demographic and racial problem as a nation-made problem. At first, it was a question of using coercive means to block the phenomenon of immigration, which was impoverishing proletarian Italy of its only resource. Then it was a question of facing the problem of its quantitative growth, the problem of problems, as Mussolini said, has defined it in a famous 1927 article entitled "Number Means Strength." He observed that the demographic question was the hardest touchstone that the conscience of fascist generation will be measured against, and that was to show if the soul of fascist Italy is or is not irreparably hedonistic and affected by stuffy bourgeois attitudes. A large number of scientists promptly answered the appeal. The decade starting from that moment in time and leading up to the 38 racial law represented a blossoming of treaties and practical realization on the theme of demography and race. This theme was not considered purely quantitatively as a numerical expansion of the population, but also quantitatively. That is, an improvement of population in terms of biology, genetics, and psychology. It was mainly anthropologists, geneticists, biologists, and doctors who worked on this front. It is only this commitment and this background we can explain how, at a time when the regime embarked upon its racial campaign and legislation, it also found so many eminent scientists ready and willing at hand. We must not forget that the racial campaign was launched through a manifesto of racist scientists and at the head of the race office of the Ministry of Popular Culture was Salvatore Isco, Dean of the Faculty of Science at the University of Rome and eminent member of the National Research Council. Undoubtedly, in this active participation of such a huge chunk of Italian science in the racial policy, it is possible to identify some characteristics that were typical of a racial view prevalent in certain Italian political and cultural context, which I defined here earlier as a spiritualistic view. Within Fascism, that were influential trends going back to the dogma of German biological racism, and that therefore put the Jewish question in the same context as Hitler theoretician. But this was not the dominant trend. An open conflict arose between German-like biological trends and the majority view, represented by Pende and Visco, supporting a spiritualistic view of racism that could be easily acceptable to the Catholic world and the Vatican. Let us now discuss the attitude of the scientific community in the face of racial policy. We could say the scientific community as a whole allowed itself to be dragged into the racial policy. The objective that Italian science accepted without any significant complaint was the following. The population, culture, and particular Italian science had to be cleansed of its Jewish elements. After all, the regime has selected a crucial doctrinal and practical point. To rebuild the Italian people, it was necessary to start from the foundation by focusing on the education of the young, the brand new Italians. Therefore, the realization of a racially pure school was the main tool for realizing this objective, and certainly it was not coincidence that, and this is the difference with Germany, the first legislative measure for the defense of the race had as their objective the school and university system and the purging of the system of the Jewish elements. This objective was accepted and followed by the academic and university community, in particular by the scientific community. On October 38, the journal Vita Universitaria, the magazine of the University of Rome, published ahead of time the full authorized list of professors who, by fault of the new laws, were to abandon teaching in October. The university community was therefore all set to fill the gaps which were to be created by the departure of about 100 full professors and many other assistants and researchers of Jewish research. From that point onwards, it was like a chord that continued to sing that the expulsion of Jewish colleagues would not create problems for the university, but on the contrary, would be the start of a glorious new phase in the academic and scientific life of the country. The university world accepted the racial policy of the regime at both the theoretical and practical level. At the theoretical level, all the specific and superior characteristics of Italian science were highlighted, and the need to free it from the presence of contamination contribution from totally different races was stressed. Hence, the development of a campaign trumpeting the values of the Italian race and science, the undisputed superiority and the need for a autarkic development. At the practical level, the regime measures were scrupulously applied, excluding all Jewish colleagues from participating in the university and scientific life. The enforcement of the racial measure was not superficial. It was supervised by the Central Demographic Bureau of the Ministry of the Interior, which had been transformed into the General Direction for Demography and Race. The new bureau showed itself to be zealous, promoting a census of all the Jews present in Italy, carried out in record time in September 38. On the basis of files so far found in all the archives, it is clear that practically all Italian Jews were registered. This centralized registration was accompanied by registration by the local police station in often incredible, pedantic fashion. Information was collected concerning even the minutest details. This ranged from the prohibited presence of servants in the home to the prohibited frequenting of holiday resorts, and to the list of publishers having published books written by Jews, to the owning of radios, camera of animals, even the control over access to the property of aliens or illegal inclusion in the telephone directory. The thrust of the anti-Jewish racial policy of Fascism is demonstrated above all by the overwhelming nature of the related legislation. The first decree law provided from the exclusion of Jewish student teachers from all the schools, universities, academies, societies of science, letters, and art, and deprived the Jews of foreign extraction of their nationality. Then the measures referring to the school and university were combined into a consolidated text. In November, a first complete and comprehensive law in defense of race was promulgated, with provision concerning marriages, obligating the celebrating official to determine the race and nationality of the couple. A definition was also given for the members of the Jewish race, their rights, and those among them who could be discriminated, and so on. One important specific feature of the racial policy is that it began on the field of education and culture. The predominantly cultural nature of racial policy is confirmed by the establishment, again on September 38, of the Higher Council for Demography and Race, composed almost entirely of university staff, including many well-known scientists. In the meantime, the review La Difesa della Razza had already begun publication, benefiting from massive financial support with the participation of several of the largest banks and industries in the country. Its diffusion in the university was imposed in a circular by the Minister of National Education, Bottai. He wrote, "I am certain that universities will fall into line and will work together toward the attainment of the goals that the regime had set itself in order to safeguard the genius of the race." Even before the leisure laws were promulgated, this zealous minister had initiated a census of Jewish teachers, delivering race determination forms to all the school and university authorities. Already on the eve of the promulgation of the laws, the journals Il Tevere and Vita Universitaria published the list of Jewish university professors demanding they forfeit their shirts. It also published the list of school textbooks written by Jewish authors. The Italian Jewish community numbered less than 50,000 persons, in addition to about 10,000 foreign Jews who had been living and working in Italy for many years. Nearly 4,000 of them, including professors, military personnel, public and private sector office workers, liberal professionals, and businessmen were stripped of all civic rights, and about 6,000 students expelled from schools and universities. The number of upper secondary school teachers expelled amount to 174, that of university full professor to 99, about 7% of the whole category. In the disciplinary areas most affected, the losses were full professors, 18 in medicine, 17 in mathematics, physics and chemistry, 23 in the field of law, 20 in the arts of philosophy, and philosophy. Of course, this numerically predominates 7% of university full professors coming from the 0.1% Jewish component of total Italian population gave rise to the customary attempts to account for Jewish preeminence in the cultural field, in science in particular. Some described it as the result of a plot, others as demonstrating the fact that science had taken a turn for the worse by having become the expression of the typically Jewish mental set inclined toward abstractness and formalized theory far removed from intuition. However, it should be noted that the clash between Jewish science and Aryan science, which was a classical theme in German racism, did not have a strong following in Italy, except in a series of articles published in Difesa della Razza. A rapid perusal of the names of the university professors expelled gives some idea of the cultural devastation caused by the racial law. The famous Italian School of Physics, the so-called Via Panisperna boys, renowned the world over for its pioneering research in nuclear physics, was literally wiped out. Scientists of the caliber of Bruno Rossi, the founder of cosmic ray theory, Enrico Fermi, which was not Jewish but whose life was Jewish, Emilio Segre, Ugo Fano, and Eugenio Fubini, physicist also, emigrated to the United States. Franco Rasetti, also not an Aryan, emigrated to Canada rather than remaining a counter responsible for such disgraceful behavior. Giulio Racah, physicist, moved to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Leo Pinkerle, physicist, emigrated to England. Sergio De Benedetti and Bruno Pontecorvo to Paris, the latter finally to Soviet Union. In mathematics too, the quality of the loss was more significant than the actual numbers. In the first place, Vito Volterra, nicknamed Mr. Italian Science, and Tullio Levi-Civita, perhaps the greatest Italian mathematician of the time, one of the most important mathematicians worldwide, author of fundamental contribution to the mathematical tools of relativity theory. Then Beppo Levi, Guido Fubini, the creator of differential projective geometry, Guido Castelnuovo, and Federico Enriquez. You see here Federico Enriquez speaking as a friend with Albert Einstein, the leaders of the world-famous Italian school of algebraic geometry. Another disaster was the destruction of the Turin School of Biology, founded by the distinguished histologist Giuseppe Levi. In addition to Levi himself, two of his students and future Nobel laureates were lost to Italian science: Salvatore Ludia, called in the United States Salvador Edward Ludia, and Rita Levi-Montalcini. The biomedical science lost Maurizio Ascoli, Camillo Arton, Mario Kamitz, Amedeo Erlitzka, and Mario Donati, the greatest Italian surgeon of the time. Chemistry lost two of its main protagonists in the industrial sector of the discipline, Giacomo Mario Levi and Giorgio Renato Levi. In the field of statistics, mention by be made of Giorgio Mortara, who was the only researcher in the field of statistical and demographic science who could match the prestige of Corrado Gini, and Roberto Bacchi, who emigrated in Israel, where he founded the Israeli Statistical Bureau. Perhaps the most ironical aspect of the matter was the fact that the regime lost several of its most authoritative theoreticians in the field of the fascist corporative law. Gino Arias, Giorgio Del Vecchio, and Guido Tedeschi, who emigrated also to Palestine, as well as the economist Bruno Foà, Gustavo Del Vecchio, Marco Fani. Other distinguished names were the eminent geographer Roberto Almagià. All the maps hanging in the school and offices had to be replaced as they bore his name. The literary historian Attilio Momigliano and the philosopher Rodolfo Mondolfo. The fallout from this devastation was often quite unexpected. One case in point is that of the biologist Tullio Terni, I have not a photo of Terni, who committed suicide in 1946 when he was expelled from the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei because of his previous fascist sympathies. To be considered on a par with dyed-in-the-wool fascists who had had much greater responsibilities, such as the mathematician Francesco Severi, who got his Rome University chair back in less than 2 years after post-war purge, or the physiologist Sabato Visco, who was actually able to resume his post as dean of the faculty, appeared to Terni as an even greater infamy than that of 1938. The freeing of such a large number of posts led to an occasionally indecent rush to occupy the vacant chairs. Some fascist circles did not turn a blind eye to the consequences. How to replace so many scientists without lowering the qualitative level of Italian scientific research? There was no unanimity. Some shared the opinions of Sabato Visco, who, during a speech delivered before the Chamber of Deputies, claimed that the university had viewed the loss of Jewish teachers with the greatest indifference and had indeed gained in spiritual unity. According to Visco, the catastrophic forecast of certain right-minded thinkers had proved groundless. Indeed, the festival review of the University of Rome, Vita Universitaria, which was to give space to his speech in the wake of the martial law, and warned that, I quote, "it will not be easy to cover all the chairs with scientifically well-trained elements." And it suggested filling the gaps with temporary posting because, I quote, "the intention had not been to expel the anti-fascists, the old, and the Jews from the Italian university in order to fill them with the untrained or the merely cunning." This kind of concern did not trouble in the slightest the scientific commission of the Italian Mathematical Union. Meeting on December 38, it released the following communique, which represents one of the most disgraceful acts of compromise between the world of science and the anti-Jewish racial campaign. The Scientific Commission of the Mathematical Italian Union met on December in a room of the Mathematical Institute of the Royal University of Rome. After a friendly, exhaustive discussion, the following was decided. A representative of the Union will visit the Minister of National Education and notify him of the Commission vote against any of the mathematics chair left vacant as a result of race integrity measures being taken away from the mathematical disciplines. The Italian School of Mathematics, which has gained great renown through the scientific world, has practically been created entirely by scientists of Italian Aryan race. Even after the elimination of several Jewish Italians cultori, one can translate experts or cultivators, it has retained scientists that in number and quality suffice to maintain Italian mathematical science at a very high level in comparison with the situation abroad. It can also avail itself of teachers whose intense effort of scientific proselytism ensure that the nation has elements that are worthy to cover all the required posts. In this ridiculous, brazen-faced document, the pupils were raised to the rank of teacher worthy of covering all the necessary posts, and that teacher were downgraded to the rank of mere Jewish experts. The regime rewarded the mathematicians for their zeal by setting up the National Institute of Higher Mathematics, the direction of which was entrusted to Francesco Severi and which was inaugurated in the presence of the Duce. Here are some interesting photos. It's in particular interesting for me because this hall is the main hall of the department in which I live, and sometimes I gave some lecture in this hall, and you can see here Francesco Severi was reading his text in the inauguration of the National Institute of Higher Mathematics, then Mussolini and the Minister of National Education, Bottai. Now the subsequent photo is in front. You see clearly Severi, Mussolini, and Bottai. And here you have another photo of the library in which I walk now. And Mussolini is visiting the new library with Francesco Severi, and you see they are with the, how do you say, stivali, the boots, yes. And here Bocchiani was the director of the Department of Mathematics Institute. At the same time, there was founded another institute, the National Institute for Calculus Application, which was entrusted to Mauro Piccone, another great mathematician, very important, who considered himself as the fascist mathematician. The two great fascist mathematicians vied with each other for primacy of the representation of fascism in mathematics and of mathematics in fascism, arguing over the question whether it was preferable and more advisable for fascist society to follow the pure approach Severi or the applied one Piccone. There is no doubt that in a period unfavorable to the creation of basic research agencies, Severi's Institute represented a novelty on the international scientific scene, comparable only with a few other institutions, such as the French Institute Henri Poincaré in Paris or the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. In actual fact, however, the analogy with the Forced institution was formal for both the two, because both two were forced to vegetate in complete isolation from international research. Indeed, advanced scientific research had been of a rebirth of Italian geometry. The Minister of National Education, Giuseppe Bottai, although not having a clue about this kind of question, was willing to back up this attitude. He was invited to give the keynote address at the second Congress of the Mathematical Union, Italian Mathematical Union in 1940, with the chairman mathematician Luigi Bezzolari, and defined it as truly national. And it was to show that even after the departure of the professor of Jewish race, there was no decrease in the scientific production of our country, and indeed it had taken on new life and vigor in the fascist regime. Bottai, in turn, proclaimed that, I quote, Italian mathematics, no longer the monopoly of mathematicians from other races, regained its own specific genius and multifaceted nature, as a result of which the Casorati, the Pioschi, the Betti, the Cremona, and the Beltrami, many Italian mathematicians, Aryan Italian mathematicians, shone in the climate of unity of the fatherland, and with the power of the purified and liberated race, it resumes its upward path. Only rarely has such a proclamation of resurrection turned out to be nothing but an obituary. In Italy, the phenomenon of scientific immigration did not reach the same massive proportion as in Germany. Since the racial policy of the fascist regime did not represent a direct threat to life, in many cases the Jewish scientists did not emigrate, especially in those cases in which their advanced age made it difficult to abandon the established context of their lives and face the difficulty involved in starting again in a totally different social and cultural context. Those that Arthur Koestler in his book Arrow in the Blue called the risks of misery and aimlessness of permanent exile. However, the limited extent of the migratory phenomenon did not alleviate the negative effect of the racial policy. This can be seen if you consider the reinstatement of Jewish university teachers after the war. This, the last theme that I will deal with after concluding. This restatement of expelled Jewish teacher took on a peculiar form. Since none of those who had taken their places were removed, the restated Jewish teachers were assigned new chairs and ad personam, which were cancelled with their death. In this way, a sort of category of social misfits was created who were admitted to participation in university life, the flow of which had practically not been modified vis-à-vis the period prior to the fall of fascism. The reinstated had now become extraneous to the new context that had been created, to the organization of the scientific school and to the power structure. A factor that had limiting effect on the immigration process was related to the peculiar attitude adopted by Italian Jews in the face of the national situation. Indeed, if a country existed in which, at least in the early years of national unity, the process of Jewish emancipation had been successful, this was Italy. The vast majority of Italian Jews had been largely assimilated and felt they were Italian citizens in all senses of the word, without envisaging the concept of a dual Italian Jewish status. Italian Jews were patriotic, often more than the others, almost as is to show their gratitude for their liberation from segregation in the ghettos and from discrimination. They fought in the Great War, suffered casualties and won their medals. Nor did this attitude change with the rise to power of fascism. And comparatively large number of Jews wear black shirts, and when the regime demanded that state functionaries should take an oath of loyalty, only 12 university professors refused to do so. 4 of them were Jews. Among the mathematicians, only Vito Volterra refused to take the oath, not Castelnuovo, not Levi Civita, who was an anti-fascist, not Enriquez, who was a sympathizer of the regime. A comparative large number of Jewish professors taught comparative law, and several participated in the drafting of the early stages of the regime democratic and eugenic policy. This merely shows that they thought and acted like ordinary Italians, and that their links with Judaism were often reduced to retaining a family name that indicated their ancient origin. Also, the attitude of Italian Jews concerning Zionism is consistent with this picture. Support given to Zionism was only a marginal significance until the pressure of the regime convinced the Jew to turn to the side. The waving on the banner of Zionism by the regime as a proof of Jewish duplicity regarding their national conscience was a mere pretext to justify the persecution. The racial laws was a real drama for Italian Judaism, especially in the intellectual sphere, which was reluctant to admit that the happy times were now remote, in which one could be confident in the full participation of Jews in the life of the nation. Those were the times in which the Jew, Vito Volterra, heals and democratic, progressive, anti-fascist, was able to declare in lyrical tones, even in a touch of Latin racing, what follows. I wish to conclude particularly with this quotation, which is very impressive in my point of view. Gentlemen, wrote Volterra, I come from the center of Latinness. The country in which I have spent my life is the very cradle of the Latin people. This landscape and this sky, which over the centuries have witnessed so many important historical events, this very air that one breathes there, all enable us to relive a distant past and mingle with the great memories and present events and future dreams. All those here like me have faith in this ancient, fertile and vigorous Latin race. Latin race, not the Jewish race. But war has illuminated many facts, and like all that arouses extraordinary and unexpected emotion with its terrible lightning bolts, has revealed the true nature of individuals. The first war, obviously, the first World War, of people and of things. How our way of judging has changed. How many surprises mankind and nation have reserved for us. Mankind was heroic and was unaware of it. Many of those that we believe to be civilized were none other than barbarians and criminals. Here the allusion is to Germans, obviously. It was murmured that the Latin people were ancient, that they had grown old, that they were weak, and that in the struggle for existence one day or another they would be doomed to succumb. For the group of nations comprising it, the Latin race is now stronger than any other period in the history. It is infinitely more heroic than in the past. If the word virtue is given its Latin sense of virtus, it is virtus that is today the characteristic of the Latin race. I have quoted this passage in full, as it's come from the pen of one of the greatest Italian scientists of the time, a Jew, because it shows more than would be possible in a way how great was the degree of assimilation of Jews into the national community. And conversely, it reveals the dramatic nature of the gradual marginalization of this community reached its peak with the 38 racial law, the episode that more than any other attests to this drama was the suicide of the Jewish publisher Angelo Fortunato Formigini. In the aftermath of the promulgation of the racial laws, he jumped off the tower of the Ghirlandina in Modena. The cynical comment of the National Fascist Party secretary Achille Starace was, "He died like a Jew. He jumped off a tower to save a pistol bullet." Thank you.
Well, I think we have time for some questions. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
How did the Italian science fare in the immediate post-war period?
How did
Italian science rebuild itself in the post-war period?
how it was rebuilt?
Yes.
Simply continuously with not really break with the fascist situation. It was clear there means a decline in Italian science because of the loss of many scientists and the radical change in the structure of the scientific community. But in fact, all the fascist professors were assumed their post, so there was a total continuity with the fascist period. A total continuity.
You have a question? Yes.
When did the discourse change from talking about religion to talking about eugenics and race with respect to Jewish?
Just in the 20s. In the 20s, when Mussolini, we could say exactly in the 27, Mussolini published a paper, a newspaper article, I quote it, number means strength, which posted the demographic and eugenetic problem as the central problem of the fascism. But at the same time, as I told, there was a problem of relationship with the Catholic Church, which was contrary to a problem of an approach of biological racism and the style of the German racism. So they accepted a more spiritualistic approach, but in fact, at the mid of the 20s.
Any other questions? Well, okay then. Thank you.
Position, please.